and good evening to everybody from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Good afternoon to those of you in the UK, and good morning to those of you in a morning time zone. My name is Salim Ul Haq. Please call me Salim. I am the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University Bangladesh in Dhaka, where I'm speaking from. And it's my pleasure to be the co-moderator of this series of events called the UK-Bangladesh Climate Partnership Forum. This series of events is sponsored by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, which is the new name for what we used to know as DFID or DFID, and is jointly organized by Mott MacDonald and the Overseas Development Institute in London. I'm delighted to be moderating this with my colleague Simon Maxwell from the UK, who I'll hand over to in a minute. But before I do that, let me just remind everybody that this is the first of a series of 8 events that we will be holding, 2 each on the 4 major topics that we have before us. Firstly, adaptation resilience, which is the topic of today's event. Then we'll have one on nature-based solutions, another one on clean growth, and a 4th and final one on finance. And in each of these themes, we will have a set of 2 events, the first one being a much more technical event focusing on some actual activities here in the UK as well as Bangladesh. And then the second event is a more high-level discussion about what can we do, both Bangladesh and the UK together as we go forward towards COP26. So let me now hand over to Simon, who will tell us a little bit more about how this event will unfold today. Simon.
Thanks so much, Salim. We're going to be handing the stick from one to another quite a few times, so probably we'll drop it at some point, but we're very glad to be doing this with you. 3 things about this series and then a couple of administrative points about this meeting. First of all, it's great to be doing this between the UK and Bangladesh. They're both leaders in different ways on the climate side. The UK hosting the COP next year, of course, and Bangladesh chairing the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And as we're going to hear later, also a leader on many aspects of climate change. And what we hope will come out of this is a community of practice between the 2 countries, people working on these topics, but also possibly use these meetings as a platform for action we can take together to increase ambition and deliver change through the COP process leading up to Glasgow. Now, Salim and I are both very keen, and the organisers too, to make sure that this is not about one country telling another how to do things in climate. The UK brings a good deal of experience to this, but of course so does Bangladesh. And it's astonishing really what progress Bangladesh has made, particularly on this issue of adaptation and resilience. You know, we all remember the cyclone in 1971, which killed 500,000 people, 500,000 people in Bangladesh, and what enormous steps Bangladesh has taken since then in improving its own adaptation and resilience. So no doubt there are lessons to learn both ways. And thirdly, we want these meetings and discussions to be as granular as possible. You know, it's very easy to get to the end of a discussion like this and say that the main conclusion is we all agree adaptation and resilience are really important topics. And we want to say that to each other at the beginning and then get into the detail, the who, the where, the why, the what, the how much, the sequencing, the costs. And that's why we're very glad to be having these case studies to begin to illustrate those issues, and we hope we can take them on in the discussion. A few practicalities. We're on the record, so you can be as indiscreet as you like, but you will go down in history for being so. There's a hashtag for social media, which is hashtag UKBD COP26. We have a meeting chat column for comments, so please don't raise your hand, use the chat box, but we encourage people not so much to ask questions, but actually to contribute to the discussion so we can have an interesting conversation today about adaptation and resilience. And then finally, time's tight, please stick to your time limit, speakers. And to tell you all, there will be a report after the meeting and a discussion page on both Facebook and LinkedIn. And here you are, Salim, here is the stick back for the next section.
Thank you very much, Simon. So let me pick up the baton from Simon and move us to the next part of our presentations. We're going to, before I introduce the main speakers, let me invite Judith Herbertson, who is the head of the FCDO Bangladesh office, who has kindly joined us to maybe say a few words of opening remarks for the event today, as well as for the series as a whole. Judith, would you like to share some thoughts?
Thank you very much indeed, Salim, and thank you, Simon. It's very good to be working with you again. On behalf of the Commonwealth and Development Office, I would like to welcome you all here. And forgive me, Salim, I'm not the head of the FCDO. Our High Commissioner is the head, and as it's on the record, I feel the need to point that out. Not at all. No, please, no apologies needed. We're between friends. So the FCDO is the merger between the Foreign Office and the former DFID. Going back, I recall the partnership launch between the UK and Bangladesh on climate at the British High Commission here in Dhaka in January, where many of you asked us to continue discussing the themes of COP26 between the two countries: adaptation and resilience, clean energy transition, clean transport, finance, and nature-based solutions. It seems like a lifetime ago. We've all been preoccupied with the pandemic since, which has brought the world to some extent to its knees and caused untold suffering. But without wishing to play down the impact of COVID-19, I fear that this will prove to be something of a dress rehearsal for what is facing all of us through the impacts of climate change. And as we all know, because that's why we're here on a Tuesday morning, afternoon, evening, we're in a much bigger fight now for the health of our planet, and there is no vaccine available. To protect the biodiversity that provides the balance we need, to provide a smooth transition to renewable energy, to reduce our demand for energy indeed, including through a move to clean public transport, and to adapt our agriculture, use of land, water, infrastructure, and make it sustainable, and to build long-term resilience to the fires, the increase in temperatures, and the rise in sea levels. The UK-Bangladesh Partnership on Climate Change. I'm just looking at all this chat where people can't hear what we're saying. I'm going to carry on. The UK-Bangladesh Partnership on Climate Change will use all the tools at our disposal: strong diplomatic engagement, technical expertise, funding, and our shared regional network, and of course beyond the region. And we from the FCDO here will be engaging with government, development partners, NGOs, academia, business groups, and young leaders. Very importantly, young leaders, young people. And we will be integrating climate and environment objectives across our work. All the work we do out of the British High Commission will be considering what we're doing through a lens of the impact on climate and environment. And we're also, as many of you know, planning a much more dedicated programme portfolio for climate change to reflect the scale of need, or to try to respond to the scale of need. And all of our planned programme funds, the UK's COP26 objectives. So I welcome this opportunity to hear from those on the very front line in Bangladesh and in the UK, and to hear the different approaches to very similar challenges with different contexts. So the purpose of this forum, the event tomorrow, and the subsequent 3 events, and you won't hear me doing this preamble at all of them, but is to exchange experiences so that both sides can learn and both can become more resilient through supporting their countries and their regions, particularly so that we can accelerate action globally, regionally, nationally, and locally, right down to the front line. And one of the UK's, as you know, overall objectives for COP26 is to ensure inclusive participation. We want to hear voices from the front line, from the young, from the experts. We want to hear from governments. We want to hear from the private sector, from people with funding, from people without funding. We want to hear from our friends and from people we haven't heard from yet. And we want to be challenged. We want new ideas, and we want tried and tested ideas. We're going to need everybody and all the ideas and thinking in this conversation. So please use this forum to learn, to listen, to suggest, but also to make new contacts and to follow up after the event. We don't want the work to stop when the meeting finishes. For the UK, for Bangladesh, the work doesn't stop after COP26. I hope you really enjoy this evening. Thank you, Salim. Simon, back to you.
Thank you very much, Judith, for those words of encouragement. And I think particularly something that both Simon and I are very keen is to have something come out of this that is a actionable set of activities and agendas that we can follow up with all the speakers and panelists that we have and participants. So let me now tell you a little bit about how we are going to proceed for the next section, which is a set of 4 presentations, 2 from the UK, 2 from Bangladesh, by 4 very distinguished speakers whom I'll introduce. And for each of them, we also have a designated distinguished discussant. So the speakers, the main speakers will get 5 minutes each, the discussants 3 minutes, and then we will go through all of the 4 papers one by one before we then open it up for discussion, which Simon will moderate. And as Simon said, we are not really that keen to have specific questions to specific speakers, but to pick up on the discussion and talk about what you think we can do going forward. So a forward-looking discussion rather than a backward-looking asking questions. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll get the speakers to respond to you at a later date perhaps, but in the discussion we would like to have a forward-looking discussion. So the 4 papers that we have, they're on the screen now. The first one is addressing the adverse impacts of climate change in the urban areas of Bangladesh. That's going to be presented by Dr. Ghulam Rabbani, who is head of the Climate Bridge Fund at BRAC, at Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat in BRAC. The second one will be engaging communities in climate resilient housing development by Brian Kilkelly, who is the development lead at EIT Climate KIC. And then the third presentation from Bangladesh will be Resilient Shoreland Coastal Communities by Mr. Bazlul Karim, who is the deputy leader of the Shore Development and Settlement Program. And then the fourth and final one for today is on improving the flood resilience of existing housing stock in the UK by Ed Sati, who is with the BRE Centre for Resilience. And as I said, for each of these presentations, we also have a designated discussant who will take a few minutes to reflect. Oh, here we have the panelists. So the panelists are Professor Mashfiqus Salehin, who's with the Institute of Water and Flood Management, Bangladesh, the Engineering University. Dilruba Haider, who is the Disaster Risk Reduction, Climate Change and Humanitarian Actions with UN Women in Bangladesh. We have Denise Bauer, who's the Executive Director of the External Engagement for Mott MacDonald, who are one of the sponsors of these events. And then Erin Roberts, who is the Research Associate at Overseas Development Institute and who has a lot of experience working in Bangladesh with my center a few years ago. So nice to have Erin with us again. So let me now hand over to our first presenter, who will have 5 minutes to give his presentation, and then we will have a designated discussant for him. The topic is addressing the adverse impacts of climate change in urban areas of Bangladesh, and the speaker is Dr. Ghulam Rabbani, who is the head of the Climate Bridge Fund of the Bridge Fund Secretariat of BRAC. Dr. Rabbani, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salim Haq. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very humble to share my experience of the Climate Bridge Fund in Bangladesh. In fact, this Climate Bridge Fund was established by BRAC in 2019 in association with the government of Germany through KfW. So since then, we have been operationalized, and we are currently working in 5 selected urban areas in Bangladesh. So I will be sharing in next 4 or 5 minutes on the major climatic problems in the urban areas and also in the rural settings, and what are the needs of the urban communities and existing adaptation, resilience, and potential solutions with all of you. Can we go for the next slide? As I mentioned, that a number of climate-related hazards that include flood, cyclone and storm surge, drought, riverbank erosion, saline water intrusion, sea level rise, and other heat wave, cold waves, these actually affect the rural people in the origin and also the urban people in the destination, that I will be sharing with you in the next slides. So these are the climate-related problems really affect this the life and livelihoods of the rural communities, and the people in the rural areas, they are bound to migrate or displace to the urban areas. Next slide, please. So these are the sets of the climate-related problem urban communities experience. For example, waterlogging. When there is excessive rainfall for several hours, in the entire area gets waterlogged, and people have face really problems with their mobility and other domestic works. And drainage congestion, erratic drainage are the additional problems those really affect these communities. Next slide, please. So what happens is, based on the earlier experiences of BRAC, for example, and also climate change program and other different programs of the BRAC, they tried to establish this climate bridge fund, as I said before, to work and to address the problems of the climate migrants. So there are two major objectives to establish this climate bridge fund. The number one, to reduce the vulnerability of the migrants in the selected 5 municipalities and city corporation areas. And the second objective is to enhance the institutions on adaptation solutions, so that they can avoid the climate-related problems and continue with the sustainable solutions in these urban areas. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of problems that they face in the urban areas, the number one I would say is the waterlogging or flood. So due to this and waterlogging, their livelihoods gets challenged, and the water scarcity that affects these people in the normal period and also the disaster period. So in addition to these problems, they face the contaminated water and also access to sanitation, access to that water supply. And there is another problem that the entire country faced in 2019 is the dengue incidences. And if you consider the dengue incidence in Bangladesh in 2019, the incidences of dengue was very high in the urban areas. So the health problems, water supply problems, sanitation problems, drainage congestions, and different other sets of problems become almost regular event in the slums. So based on these problems and needs of the climate migrants in the urban areas, of BRAC. So what we are expecting in next 4 major call for proposal in 2020. 2 of the projects will be implemented by BRAC programs, and 2 of the projects will be implemented by NGOs. 4 will basically implement the rainwater harvesting, plain rich well, deep well, pipe water supply, sanitary latrine, and they will provide microcredit to meet the immediate needs of the urban communities, so that they can avoid their livelihood challenges and also can continue their sustainable livelihoods in the urban areas. So CBF supported projects will also initiate the training on livelihoods and technology livelihood solutions, for example, for men and women separately. So the women will get separate livelihood, for example, sewing machines, so that they can work at the household and they can sell the clothes in the markets. So this type of technologies. The other technologies that I can refer you is improved cook stoves, access to health services, and construction of drainage system to keep the slums clean and environmental friendly, and solid waste management. So these are the potential solutions that we can see, the CBF supported projects will implement in next 4 years. And one of the major principles that we can share with you is, out of these 4 projects, 1 project will target 100% women beneficiaries, because one of the principles of CBF is to integrate gender aspects in the implementation of the adaptation and resilience solution. So we received my last point will be, we received 102 concept note or project ideas in the first call, and we can only support 4 projects in the first call. And the challenges that we see under this first call for proposal and the implementation mechanism of the CBF projects is, the number one is the policy. We do not really have any specific policy on the climate change mitigation. Of course, there are a number of national policy. For example, Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, 7th 5-year plan. They recognize the climate change induced migration, but there is no specific policy. So there is a small challenge that we see. Second challenge that we see, the need versus available allocation. When we visit the different urban areas, we see that almost every urban areas of the country needs the support and needs the different adaptation solutions. But unfortunately, we cannot cover all people and every urban areas. And CBF selected only 5 areas, as I mentioned, and these areas actually represent, flood-prone zone, drought-prone zone, and the coastal zone. So we are trying to support, NGOs, NGOs, so that they can implement this project and support the communities. So this is extremely important that we integrate gender aspect and we make sure that the projects are implemented to improve their resilience and adaptation capacity of the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabbani, for that excellent presentation and excellent work that you're doing in these 5 urban areas. Let me now turn to the discussant or panelists that we have invited to make a comment on this presentation. It's Denise Bauer from Mott MacDonald. Denise, you have the floor. If you can do it within 3 minutes, that'd be great.
I'm happy to comment, but this isn't the one that I was expecting to comment on.
Oh, really?
I was expecting to comment on the 3rd case study.
Yeah, this one, Erin, I think, is the person that should be speaking.
Okay, Erin. Okay, my apologies. I mixed them up. Okay, Erin, would you like to make your comments?
Yeah, absolutely.
Apologies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabbani. It's a pleasure to see you again. As Salim mentioned, I spent almost 2 years. I was based in Dhaka for 1.5 years, and I had the great pleasure to work with you as well as Salim and his team. So I know the policy context decently well, and I also did my PhD on the evolution of loss and damage policy in Bangladesh. So for me, the CBF is very distinctly Bangladesh. So when I think about Bangladesh, I think about self-determination and a country that, though vulnerable, is very, very strong. And you've seen that from the Prime Minister and how she interacts with other states at the General Assembly. Bangladesh might be vulnerable, but Bangladesh is very much determined to find ways of addressing climate change. So I really appreciate the CBF and how it's evolved. We've been talking about migration in our work on, as you know, I primarily work on loss and damage, and we've been talking about migration as long as I've been working on climate change, and certainly since I've worked in Bangladesh, I continue to work in Bangladesh. And I read from your work, Dr. Rabbani, that by 2050, 1 in 7 Bangladeshis will be displaced by climate change. And it's so important that we support migrants where they choose to go, but we also find ways of supporting those who are left behind. So I noticed that you're also doing work on that. I'm really, really interested to hear more about that. I think we'll do a field trip next time I'm in Bangladesh, Salim, to look at the 4 sites and all the great work that you're doing. I don't think I have more to say on that. I'm just really excited to hear more about your work and happy to be engaged in any way that I can. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Erin, and we look forward to having you back again in Bangladesh. Let me now move on to the second presenter, who is going to be presenting from the UK. We have Brian Kilkelly, who is the development lead of EIT with Climate Kick, and he's going to be presenting on engaging communities in climate resilient housing development in the UK. Brian, you have the floor. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and share with you some of the insights that we've been learning. So personally, I've been working in on sustainability and on real estate development and climate change for about 15 years. The last 5 years working for Europe's principal innovation agency on climate innovation. So our role for the European Commission has been to fund great ideas that can help us tackle climate change, but also build businesses and create new kind of entities that can tackle the climate crisis. We've been learning how to kind of tackle climate change through innovation over these 10 years. And what I'd like to share with you is a little bit of an insight into our journey from what we sometimes term as point innovation. So supporting innovation that brings incremental improvement to really a new shift, which we call transformation in time, which is about recognizing that actually the shift needs to move so much faster. So we need to be looking at systems change, massive transformation. We can no longer put up with, if you like, incremental improvement. And I'm sure all of you on the call will recognize why I'm saying that. On the page now, you can see an example of a great point innovation. And there's, of course, we want to celebrate great ideas and great innovation that does come through. It does have its place, and it can certainly bring about systems change. So in terms of adaptation and resilience, this is a little innovation I thought I'd just share with you, which shows that there are ways in which we can avoid spending large amounts of money on big infrastructure to deal with floodwater. And this is an innovation which actually absorbs rainwater, filters it using natural means, and then makes it re-available for use for drinking, for cooking, etc. By a company called Field Factors. So it's just a little example, if you like, of a great point innovation that can be built into the urban environment. And this next slide is kind of moving on the thinking and saying, okay, how do we look at things in a different scale? And Barcelona is doing some great work here at looking at its urban form and looking at kind of the structure of Barcelona, which is around kind of blocks of houses and retail, and thinking, could you actually change the road system, for example, close off sort of roads within these blocks, and can create kind of more self-contained communities and actually repurpose the space away from cars and use it for greening, for urban agriculture, for more community space. So it's an example, if you like, of moving on from thinking about streets individually, but more looking at communities. Now we have a program which is running with 15 cities across Europe. It's called Healthy Clean Cities. And I wanted to pick out one particular example, which happens to be with the city of Edinburgh. So next slide shows you, so we're on that pinpoint in the map there of the UK, up in Edinburgh. And the next slide shows the part of Edinburgh in question. So this is a development site called Granton Waterfront, just to the north of Edinburgh. And this is a kind of a master plan area. So it's a new part of the city that the city is looking to expand. And what's exciting about this is working with the city authorities, thinking about their goals and what they want to achieve. And in particular, how could we use this opportunity for development to really accelerate the transition of Edinburgh to be zero carbon by 2030 and to meet Scotland's goals to reach its climate goals. And one of the ideas that has evolved out of this is this idea of build to live. And this is where I wanted to kind of share with you the kind of thinking around how do we bring about transformation at a much faster and a much bigger scale. And what are the systems that we need to think about? Sorry, Professor Salem, I think your microphone's still on and it's we can hear noise from yours. Thank you. One of the systems that we need to think about changing is, in fact, the finance system. And currently, the way development happens, at least in the UK, is there are large investors, large developers who typically get granted permission to build these kind of new development projects. And what Edinburgh is seeking to do is to experiment with a different kind of financial model, and that is actually to bring. So the traditional model you can see here, conventional development model, is very much focused on the kind of professionals, if you like. You've got the city council, you've got the land producer, the land purchaser, the construction companies, you've got shareholders. That's the traditional development model. And on the right-hand side, just going back again to that previous slide, on the right-hand side there, you can see the traditional relationship where you have customers who might borrow money from the bank, and they might purchase their energy from an energy company. And in a way, this diagram shows these two worlds are kind of disconnected in a way. You know, the properties are made available to residents to buy or to rent. And the new way of thinking, or an alternative, if you like, a way of thinking about the system is creating instead the idea of a village development company, where actually citizens are empowered to be part of the development process from the actual outset, and you actually create an entity which is owned by the members, by the residents, by the future residents of this development. And this is an example, if you like, of changing the system completely, so that actually the system is more driven by, powered by, rather than the traditional actors. And the exciting thing about this is that this can provide a level of resilience and a level of adaptation which is needed for, if you like, dealing with future crises like the climate crisis. It's a way in which people can be much more vested in their communities, have a much stronger interest. And if there's something that we have learned from COVID-19, and going back to what Judith had to say earlier on about the need for new ideas, these are the kind of new ideas that could really change the way our cities evolve. And we'd love to learn from Bangladesh, because we know that you have doing an amazing work on engaging your citizens in your change process. And this is an idea, if you like, which I think, you know, we really want to engage internationally to understand how do we change systems like this? How do we engage people in empowering them to be part of future systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that very, very nice illustration of how people can reorganize their own cities going forward in Edinburgh. I think one of the lessons, at least for me, is that we used to think of adaptation as very context specific, very different in different places, but it's amazing how actually they are very similar as well. You know, Edinburgh, Bangladesh, Dhaka, not all that different. We're all people, we're all living with the same problems, all trying to face the same kind of problems. So there's a lot of learning that we can do from each other, even though we're in very, very different circumstances. So let's invite our designated panelists for comments on this. Dilruba Haider is with UN Women in Bangladesh. Dilruba, would you like to share some thoughts?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Selim, and thank you very much, Brian Kilkelly, and congratulations actually for presenting such a. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. Oops. Sorry.
Take that as a celebration tune for me.
So yeah, no, I think that's a very good presentation. Especially, I could immediately see the relevance of this project of yours with not so much with our urban areas, but definitely with the southwest part of the coastal belt of the country, where people are struggling with regards to the water, drinking water problem. But let me take the opportunity to focus a bit more on because you talked about people's empowerment, and you talked about focusing on people's engagement, from people's engagement to people's empowerment. So I would like to go a step further and talk about urgency of empowerment of the most vulnerable and most affected people, which is women, girls, and gender diverse groups. In fact, in climate change, I mean, in the climate change discourse, although I'm really happy that a little while ago when Dr. Rabbani was presenting his case, he was really focusing on gender aspects. And I think that there has been definitely some progress. Like in last year in COP, we have seen that, you know, the parties have come up with the proposal of enhanced Lima work program on gender. So there are progress, but there are still a very long way to go with regards integrating gender aspects into, you know, into climate change actions. And, you know, there are a lot of reasons we know why that's the case. I mean, in addition to the, you know, discriminatory norms and socioeconomic and cultural barriers and all that, we also have, you know, barriers like we don't have sex and age disaggregated data, which would have helped to come up with gender responsive policies and programs. We also don't have enough women on the table where the decisions are made with regards policies and investments. And therefore we see this invisibility, in fact, of women and girls into the policies, climate change policies. So that actually, you know, has been a case, and there are attempts to change those things. But we really need to focus on ensuring that we have women's leadership. And we have to make sure that women are empowered enough to take part into the decisions and into implementation also of programs. And when we talk about integrating gender aspects, we really need to make the analysis of gender aspects. It's not just focusing on women. We have to understand the equations of men and women and how that equation actually interacts with the actions that we are taking for gender, for climate change adaptation, and also even for mitigation. So, I mean, just to give an example, that only 2 weeks ago I was in flood-affected areas in Kurigram in the north, and women there, people there, were hit by 5-time flooding this year. And the women had, you know, all the families, including the women and girls, had to evacuate to the embankments under the open sky for taking shelter. And the women were telling me, you know, we can't remember how many nights we had to spend without sleeping because we had to protect our adolescent girls. So these are the realities, and the protection is a real issue for the most vulnerable population, including women and girls. And unless we address those aspects, nothing that we do for adaptation and mitigation is going to work. And the final point I want to make is about the nature-based solution that we keep on talking about nowadays as a most appropriate or a very effective approach for climate change adaptation. I think we all know that, you know, women are the sort of custodians and the users of natural resources. So we have to take into account how women are interacting with the nature and thereby design our programs and approaches. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Brian, for a wonderful presentation. Over to you. Thank you
very much, Dilruba. Thank you for reminding us very important role that gender plays, and women in particular have to play all across the 4 issues that we'll be discussing, not just adaptation, resilience, nature-based solutions, but also even in renewable energy and in finance. Let me now turn to our third presenter. We'll come back to Bangladesh with this presentation. It's Mr. Bazlul Karim, who is the Deputy Team Leader of the Char Development and Settlement Project in Bangladesh, and he'll be speaking about resilient Char land coastal communities. Mr. Karim, are you with us?
I think he's been having some technical issues joining, so we're going to have Andrew Jenkins come in instead.
Okay. Andrew, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead. Do you have?
Hi, Salim. Very nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm also involved in this in the Char Development and Settlement Project with the technical assistance team. So since I'm available, and unfortunately Mr. Bazlul Karim cannot get a connection, I will give the presentation. So the case study is resilient shoreland coastal communities, and we're using the Char Development and Settlement Project in Noakhali as an example. I'll tell you when to move the slides if that's okay. So as you can see from the first slide, this is the context, and we're looking now at the map of southeastern Bangladesh coastal region. As I think people know, Bangladesh has been built up by centuries of deposition of sediments. So we have a lot of land accretion in the southeast, but we also have a lot of erosion. Currently, about 52 square kilometers of newly formed land is coming up every year, and about 32 square kilometers of old land is eroded. So there's a need for resettlement of people from the eroded land and from elsewhere into the newly accreted land. So there's considerable experience now in terms of the best way to resettle and develop these lands and develop resilient coastal communities on this land. So could I have the next slide, please? Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So you can see from this aerial picture what it looks like. You can see very large estuary on the left-hand side and new land in various states of development on the right going across to the horizon. So the Bangladesh government quite some time ago has initiated and continued to implement an umbrella project with the objectives of mitigating the vulnerabilities of climate-affected refugees from coastal communities under an integrated project. We've had 4 phases since 1994, with 6 government agencies involved and a number of non-government organisations participating fully within the project context, and a very high level of beneficiary participation, so that when we looked at, for example, the financial contributions, the beneficiary or the participant contribution was much higher than we had originally expected. So next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, I'll carry on anyway.
Say, Andrew, there is a little bit of a delay, so I am switching them. They're just not coming through yet.
Okay, I'll bear that in mind next time. So the project has been quite successful in enabling communities in the coastal zone to resettle on accreted land with increased resilience to flooding, particularly tidal flooding, cyclonic storm surges, drainage congestion, waterlogging, drought, salinity intrusion, and the initial lack of fresh water and sanitation. So a key area has been community participation, involving women and men in a range of field level institutions and groups which contribute to this process at all stages in the project design and all types of activity during implementation, and more specifically in coordination with government institutions, especially during emergency preparedness and management of natural disasters. These groups include water management groups for managing drainage and flood control, microfinance groups initiated by NGOs gaining access to microfinance, social forestry groups related to the Forest Department and social forestry as part of the project activities, tube well user groups, which are very important to maintain the water supply with newly installed tube wells, farmers forums to improve agricultural production on the new land. So yeah, the most significant coastal community awareness and contribution occurred during the severe cyclonic storms Rayanu and Amphan, where all local government institutions, union porishods, Red Cross volunteers, disaster management committees, field level institutions, mosques and so on came together to organize on the basis of previous planning and preparation very effective means of reducing mortality and morbidity during the cyclonic storm surge events, using a network of cyclone shelters which have been developed during the project. So another important key element is the integration of the key departments. We have 5 elements you can see on the slide. Protection from climate change, which involves the Water Development Board, particularly for dikes and sluices and channels. The Forest Department for forest belt development to reduce cyclonic damage during storm surges and improve environmental context. Climate change resilient infrastructure from local government engineering department, and then the tube wells an extensive number of tube wells and sanitation pit latrines supplied by Department of Public Health Engineering. Then we have land settlement and titling from the Ministry of Land, institution and development and livelihood support through non-government organisations, and finally technical assistance. So these have been very important. Particularly important element, next slide please, has been the role of the Deputy Commissioner, who is the project director of the land component, because he's actually assigned that role by the Ministry of Land. So he has a very important role in ensuring proper distribution of land on a fair basis to those people who need it and who are eligible. You can see here a family just having received their land deed, which is a big moment and a very happy moment, as you can see. But because he's the project director, he's also in a very good position to maintain proper law and order in these newly reclaimed areas. Because before this type of intervention, the land was actually allocated by land grabbers who grabbed large amounts of land through a combination of subverting the administration through offering bribes and then also terrorizing the settlers through violence. So having effective law and order on these new lands is extremely important. So the Land Ministry and the Deputy Commissioner and his staff play an absolute, and the police controlled by him, play an absolutely vital role in this entire process. Next slide, please. So in this context, I'm happy to say, based on the previous discussion, that gender equity has been a major priority, and we have introduced a number of measures, including participation, strong women's participation in all the field level institutions that I've mentioned earlier. So a major focus on gender equity from the beginning, and an important innovation in this project is that the land allocation is given 50% to men and women. So a family receiving land receives a fixed amount, but the deed is written in the name of the wife and the husband. The wife's name is written first, and if there's a divorce or an argument, then it's likely that she would retain full ownership of the land. So that has been very effective in generating gender equity within families and also reducing domestic violence. And that's had an overall very positive effect, to the extent that EFAD, which has been supporting this project, allocated their gender award for Asia and the Pacific region to this project in 2017. Right. So far, we've had distribution of land to 35,252 landless families, and there are 6,000 more in the current phase of the project. So I think this is a really useful example. We know that, as was mentioned earlier, very large numbers of people are going to be displaced. We have experience of people having been displaced and having been successfully resettled. So I think the lessons learned to build resilience are very effective. Next slide, please.
Thank you.
So one final point is that it's very important that we continue to study the hydromorphology of the coastal area so that we know which areas are accreting and going to erode, to make the maximum most useful investments together. And that's a map of a study which is actually underway at the moment within the project, to study the hydromorphology of the southeastern delta in the current situation and make those kind of predictions. Next slide, please. So finally, I'd just like to stress that we can see the resilience of the coastal communities, particularly in terms of how they handle disaster response. And we saw that during the last two cyclonic storm surges. Fortunately, the damage was not so bad in Noakhali as it was further west, but it has been very bad in the past. And at the beginning of this, the cyclone of 1970 was mentioned, which killed 500,000 people, and it was primarily in this area. So you can see that the combination of local institutions, participatory community institutions, different government departments, civil society organizations working together is particularly visible during the cyclonic storm surges, when we have the hardware in terms of the cyclone shelters, but we also need the organizational capacity and the preparations to make the maximum use, including warning people through mosque microphones. Tremendous cooperation from the mosques in getting people to get into the cyclone shelters early enough. And we've been lucky enough to have, in a sense, 2 practice sessions in the last 2 cyclones, which showed that this is working much better than before. The cyclone warning system has also been improved nationally, and all of this is coming together. So I'd like to conclude by saying that all these elements, together with the establishment of tested systems of cyclonic storm surge disaster resilience involving shelter construction, training, preparation, organisation, plus the rapid growth in agricultural production which has occurred in these new lands, and that's generated large increases in income and assets, have all helped to create communities of settlers which are much more confident and resilient in an area which is especially vulnerable to climate change. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. I always enjoy listening to your stories from Noakhali, which you know much better than I do. I always learn. Thank you. So let me now turn to our designated discussant. Now it's the turn of Denise Bauer. Denise, would you like to share some thoughts?
Thank you ever so much, and I am ready to comment on this one, so thanks
Good.
very much.
Got it right this time.
To confirm. Look, thanks, Andrew. Really fascinating presentation on the success that's been seen there in enabling resettlement in coastal communities, you know, improving resilience through flood protection and access to fresh water, and it clearly demonstrates how effective climate change adaptation can be in improving social outcomes, and you made the point really strongly about equality there as well. At Mott MacDonald, and for those who aren't aware, we're a global engineering, management and development consultancy. Our purpose is to improve society by considering social outcomes in everything we do. So supporting the Bangladesh and UK activities leading up to COP26 fully aligned with our purpose and commitments to address the physical impacts of climate change. Hearing your case study really brings out just how many synergies there are between our countries when tackling this huge challenge. Here in the UK, we can learn from these experiences to improve the resilience of our coastal communities, but also where we're having to develop on floodplains due to pressures of land usage too, I would imagine. Your messages around community participation, engaging across public sector stakeholders and social inclusion really resonate with the conversations we've been having here in the UK too. The underlying challenges are really similar, as are the means for addressing them. And as you've set out, we need leadership at all levels to adopt good practice and overcome barriers. We need institutions that can work together for the good of the communities that they support. And we must gather the evidence for change. Indeed, a lack of evidence to demonstrate the financial benefits of investment in resilience is inhibiting progress, we believe. With it, we could improve access to finance from both the public and private sectors if we can get that evidence to really make a strong case. If we can develop that investment pipeline, and that's aligned to national economic priorities, and then build into those projects the costs and benefits of investing in resilience, it then becomes easier to scale up investment and access the right forms of finance. And the earlier presentation on Bangladesh was also talking about that need to prioritise, you know, and how only 5 schemes could be selected. That prioritisation is a challenge that I would imagine we all face quite regularly. I think we also need a common understanding of the scenarios we need to be ready for. Andrew was talking about rehearsal there, and I think that's a sort of underutilised tool in the toolbox, if you like. But to be able to rehearse, we do need to understand that the impacts of climate change are complex. There's a mix of chronic and acute hazards and risks to interdependent systems, and all of that has to be considered in the design of resilience interventions. Broadening the use of a system of systems approach will build on existing activities, capacity and momentum to support ongoing prioritisation, decision making and the opportunity for transformational change. So without using the sort of term systems of systems exactly, I think it's been implied probably in all the presentations we've heard and came out quite strongly in your presentation, Andrew. I'd also like to mention that while there's clear messaging globally around net zero and the targets we need to achieve by 2050, it's not really the same for resilience and adaptation. I've joined this call off the back of a climate reset call, and the kind of youthful voice within that was really almost demanding that we act now, to do something now about what we're experiencing. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, for us as I know we're not all engineers on this call, but I find it interesting in the world of infrastructure, which is predominantly an area of focus. We maybe like to try and engineer to a solution and solve a problem rather than accept and adapt to change. And I think there's maybe a mindset shift required there. And case studies like the ones we've just been hearing really bring that to life. So really glad to hear it. I do think we've all got a part to play, and this opportunity to share knowledge and experience between Bangladesh and the UK is really exciting. It'll help us build momentum as we look forward to COP26, and it'll stimulate the type of leadership that's needed to improve climate resilience and deliver transformational change for our communities. We see COP26 as a milestone on our own journey. You know, those who are aware, we were certified as being carbon neutral as an organisation only a few weeks ago, and we're ever so proud of that. We've got a journey to net zero for ourselves, and have made some really strong commitments in the space of adaptation and resilience, which you can find. So we really fascinating set of cases so far. Looking forward to hearing the next one and then the subsequent discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Denise, and I look forward to maybe follow-up discussions where we can discuss with Mott how we can take this joint enterprise together forward. So we now have our last presentation for today, which will be done by Dr. Ed Suttie from BRE Centre for Resilience, and he'll be presenting on improving the flood resilience of existing housing stock in the UK. Ed, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, and absolutely delighted, as the other speakers have said, to be part of this knowledge sharing and learning, and I've already learnt a huge amount from my participation today. My topic today, improving the flood resilience of existing housing stock in the UK. Of the 25 million or so homes and houses in the UK, the average house was built in the 1920s. We have a very considerable legacy of old housing stock, and that's a real challenge for us around how we adapt and create and build in more resilience to those. Next slide, please. So BRE is a large science research, testing and certification business entirely focused on the built environment. The challenge we face, of course, is common. The way it manifests or is expressed is different. If we look at the UK, so 5.2 million properties are at risk from flooding in the UK. Very typical scene there of river flooding that occurs annually in some areas. And some of the stark reality is that when businesses are flooded, 40% of them fail to reopen. You know, it has very immediate economic impacts, as well as those impacts on individuals and, of course, on the properties themselves. Next slide. Fundamental to what we need to do, there are three components that we're deeply engaged in building and developing to underpin an improvement in this scenario, and it will also underpin the ability for people to take action, to motivate stakeholders, because critical we see, whilst the challenge is quite stark, sometimes taking action is quite difficult. So the first point is to have the real foundations around the standards, code of practice and guidance for flood resilience in properties, from hazard assessment through to the surveys and option development, installation, handover, and of course the critical operation and maintenance. And there's some very strong community aspects to that. That's a word I've heard a lot resonating so far today. So we're working with Syria on developing that. That will be issued early in the new year. So with that foundation, the standards, next slide please, it has to run in parallel with training. Fundamental to this, whether they are flood surveyors, insurers, loss adjusters, or critically the local authorities and the housing associations, so the groups that have extended responsibility over quite large amounts of UK housing stock, to understand and embed that learning from the guidance, but also the principles and practices appropriate for building in flood resilience. Next slide, please. And then the third element is a really, really exciting one. I'm one of these people that learns well by doing and by seeing things. So this is an aerial shot of our main campus site just north of London in Watford. And at the core of that site, we have our innovation park. That's been with us since 2003 and is continually evolving to demonstrate real buildings and the challenges that they face, whether it's to do with energy efficiency, embodied carbon, aging population, or in this case, flood resilience. And the bottom right-hand picture shows a row of Victorian terraced housing that was built in 1880 that happens to be on our site. So that was absolutely perfect when we took forward this idea of how do we get practical engagement in this, because that is a very typical house typology in our towns and cities across the UK. Next slide, please. So the great thing about that, we collaborated, we sought funding from government, from commercial partners to develop the flood resilient house, which is a permanent demonstrator of the practical interventions into an existing building that can be built in to provide improved flood resilience for that home. The Innovation Park in a normal year, not COVID year of course, would receive somewhere in the region of 10,000 professional visitors. So that's a great start to engage with those individuals to showcase how these projects were done, what sort of technologies are involved in delivering and improving flood resilience of a very standard house typology. Next slide, please. And this comes across a whole range of things around resistant measures, of course, that can be built in around flood doors and windows, to recoverable measures. So thinking more about, well, how do we aid the speedy recovery of a house if it gets flooded through the flooring systems, through the height that the electrical systems are wired through the walls, and how the kitchen is designed and delivered, because that's one of the biggest issues actually, is strip out of existing fit out. So kitchens when properties are flooded in the UK. And you can see a small image there of the sump and twin pumps that can be employed and the floor drains. And again, thinking about practice and, you know, seeing is believing, these homes are not in a flood risk area. So we engaged with the fire brigade to actually come and flood our building for us periodically. So again, we can demonstrate how the different features function, and also the speed that home can recover post-flood event. Next slide, please. And the impact of what we do is impacting in national and local plans. Of course, we're increasing the number of trained professionals. We're developing a property flood resilience database and inputting to the wider standards to ensure this update. And final slide, just to reiterate, the improvement, so engaging with stakeholders and motivating change, is built upon clear guidance, trained professionals, and showcasing flood resilience so people can really understand what it means in practical terms. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that excellent presentation. In fact, just a personal anecdote, I used to live in London for many years in Twickenham, just near the bank of the River Thames. Oh. And a number of years ago, you remember we had a big flood there, and the houses on the riverbank, which are actually very expensive houses where the rich people live, they were the ones who were flooded rather than, you know, those of us who are in the more less expensive houses nearby. But we all came together and helped each other when that happened. And so, you know, it's a common experience all over the world of dealing with these kinds of hazards. Thank you very much again. So let me now turn to our final panelist, which is Professor Mushfiqur Salehin, who's with the Institute of Water and Flood Management at the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology, our premier engineering university. Professor Salehin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Salimul Haq. You mentioned that, you know, I mean, adaptation is conventionally viewed as very context specific. But we do see, they can be very similar in different, contexts as well. And it's very clear from the presentation that Brian made. So there are some common challenges that UK and Bangladesh are facing. Maybe the manifestations, as he said, are different. So thank you, Brian, for your good presentation. So I see some takeaway points or the areas of synergies that I get, between Bangladesh and UK that I get from your presentation. That housing as a significant damage and loss element, and very much vulnerable to climatic disasters. But it's not only infrastructural damage, but also the impact on livelihood and psychosocial impacts that is a barrier for quick recovery. And how we can engage communities, how we can motivate them, into resilient construction processes, and the technical aspect, the engineering aspect of resilient housing that we saw, the standards and code of practices, the training needs, and what is needed for wider application or scaling up of this, resilient housing. So these are important. In Bangladesh, in 5 major disasters since 1998, so the total economic damage represented about 15% of GDP, and half of that was in housing sector, rural housing sector. So while we for resilient disaster housing, we need innovations in designs, some of which you already showed. So these are very important, but there are also other dimensions, important dimensions in relation to the affordability, how people will cope with damaged houses after a disaster, and also motivation of reconstruction or implementation of new housing schemes. So there have been a lot of government, efforts, NGOs, development partners, and for example, CDM. Some examples would be, activities by CDMP, CARE, IUCN, and the government initiatives, ActionAid, and the government initiatives of, Australian project and cluster village program. But these are yet to be materialized at scale. So we need to find out why and how we can do that. So when it comes to resilient infrastructure, of course, hazard is one important area, and that has geographical variability. So it's not the same everywhere. In coastal area, there are some specific hazards. In the coastal area, hazards are a little different in the northern part of the country and in the Howrah area and the hilly area. So there are some clear differences, and some areas face multiple hazards. So the requirement is also a little different. So how we can, so to me, so it's very important to also appreciate the local culture and cultural practices. So know thy culture is as important as, know thy environment. So this is very important. So how we can incorporate, how we can combine the indigenous knowledge and cultural practices with new innovative design for resilient housing. So these are very important. So and coordination between different efforts. So in Bangladesh, the House Building Research Institute of the government. So we didn't have any standard like the one you showed. We didn't have any such standard for rural housing for a long time, although there have been a lot of initiatives. But in 2018, so standard came out in association with a number of development partners and ministries. So they have standards for combining different traditional engineering methods, and how local level solutions can be integrated with newly introduced different materials. So so it provides some minimum standards with respect to different services like water supply and sanitation, what kind of materials can be used, and different hazard specific aspects that need to be considered in the design, like wind, storm surge, velocity, flood, salinity, even tornado. So a lot of design considerations have been brought in. So the important thing is, so infrastructural damage is one thing, but so the one important barrier in recovery or people's motivation for improved housing has been the lack of taking a holistic approach. So it's not only the infrastructural damage that is a big barrier, but the livelihood opportunities. So the lack of former land tenure that we already heard from the CDSP experience, and the livelihood challenges. So the economic loss that people experience after a disaster. So it becomes very difficult for them to concentrate on new improved housing. Rather they tend to more concentrate on livelihood recovery process. So we need to take a holistic approach, so a coordinated approach, and as we heard, a systems approach. So so the level of education, quality, income generating activities, these are very and livelihood rehabilitation, these and looking at specific needs of men and women, these are very important dimensions that also need to be considered while I talk about resilient housing. So so this is where I basically wanted to stop also. But one last point. So there has been a new initiative by the Prime Minister, as we all already know. So there is a plan to basically implement to the more than 8 lakhs of resilient kind of permanent housings for the landless. So I believe that is a good initiative. So but we need to take a holistic approach and integrated approach.
Thank you very much, Professor Saleen. It's now my duty to thank all our speakers, both the presenters and the discussants, and to hand over back to Simon for moderation, with an apology for being a very bad timekeeper. Simon, I'm afraid I let everybody run over their allotted time, but they were so interesting I didn't have the heart to stop anybody. I hope we have a bit more time to continue. I'm not quite sure. We have overrun our allotted time originally, but let me hand over to Simon and let's see what we can do with the remaining time that we might have. Simon, please.
Okay, thanks. You're right. They were very good case studies. So thank you, everybody. I think we've done 3 things in the last hour or so. First of all, we've demonstrated the value of Bangladesh talking to the UK. And I love these paired case studies showing different aspects of the same problem. Secondly, we've begun to build a shelf, a repository of interesting cases, which I hope we'll continue to build through the series and people can follow up. But third, and the focus of the next quarter of an hour or so, because that's about all the time we have, we've begun to build almost a manifesto on adaptation and resilience, a kind of charter of what needs to be thought about. And I've written down 11 or 12 things, and I'm going to just say them very quickly. And the challenge to all of you, the 8 speakers, the 140 odd other people who are on the call, is to comment in the chat box and say what you agree with, what you disagree with, and what's missing from my list. So here they are very quickly in just a few words each. First of all, risk is multidimensional and everywhere. So it's not just rainfall, it's heat, it's disease, it's damage to infrastructure, and it's certainly not just in Bangladesh, but it is in the UK as well. And so we need a very comprehensive, people talked about a systems approach to risk. Point 1. Point 2, it's urgent. It's really, really urgent. We can't wait and pick these things off one at a time or assume they're going to happen to us in 10 years' time. 5 disasters in Bangladesh since 1998, was it? But recurrent flooding and other climate challenges also in the UK. So this really needs to be at the top of the agenda. Third, there needs to be a holistic overview. People talked about the importance of having a policy framework, an adaptation plan, building into the Paris commitments, but also into national policy. Fourth, pilot projects are great, but this needs to be at scale because the problem is very widespread. So a real challenge for us is how to go from interesting and valuable pilot projects to something which can be implemented nationwide. And related to that, innovation, very important, but we need to go from point plus or point innovation to innovation at scale. And a question we need to discuss possibly later in this series is, what are the policy instruments that turn a good idea at the buildings research establishment or in Bangladesh into something which can be applied nationwide? We need institutions. You can't just expect these things to happen through the role of NGOs. They obviously need community institutions and supporting government institutions. Interesting to see the role, for example, of the district commissioner in Bangladesh. Power needs to be at the centre of the discussion. Power for whom? Women and men and young people, but also the marginalised and the disadvantaged in all communities. This can't be done on the cheap. We've had a number of references to loss and damage and the need for additional external funding, but we also have a need for funding within countries from national budgets. And to have a plan also means to make choices about where resources are going to be used and to have some kind of priority. And this needs to be, next point, a long-term priority, not a short-term priority, because none of these objectives, as somebody said in the chat, can be achieved in 3 or 4 years. They need to be long-term commitments, taking account especially of the longevity of infrastructure investment. As we make those choices, evidence is absolutely crucial. I think Denise made that point, and we need to have good evidence at our fingertips, which is valuable for policy and not lost in academic journals. And then finally, one of my takeaways from this is that we often talk about adaptation and resilience as if they're in silos, separate from mitigation. But as the Edinburgh example showed, actually what we're doing through building adaptation and resilience into development programs is also building long-term mitigation strategies. So you build new communities where people live closer to their work, or you redesign Barcelona so that you have more integrated communities. These are also part of mitigation strategies. So it's an error to think, it seems to me, that you can talk about adaptation and resilience independently of talking about mitigation, which brings us back to the need for a holistic approach. That was a run through very quickly because I want to give time for people to comment and to add things and to see whether or not there's something else they want to say. And we have 30 minutes left. Salim and I need a couple of minutes at the end to wrap up. But are there any speakers or panelists who would like now to say something, draw something I've missed out of the case studies, or add a comment on my checklist of 12 items for our adaptation resilience charter? And if you would like to speak, please put your name in the chat. Brian Kilkelly, you said something interesting. Why don't you quickly take the microphone and speak?
Great, thanks, Simon, and the fantastic summary, if I may say so. You did a marvellous job of summing it all up. I think I wrote the word hope there because, as you all know, it's increasingly difficult to make progress, and it will be increasingly difficult as climate crisis continues to batter us. So I think the need to kind of continue to kind of even start small with some of these things and build capacity and hope amongst our communities. And I think we mustn't give up hope. These are really tough, big things to tackle. But if we start in each community, in each place with small things, we can begin to build the muscle, if you like, for accelerating that change.
And success breeds success. I think that's important. Link to that. Erin, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Simon. I'm just trying to turn my video on. I try not to be too controversial when I'm wearing my ODI hat, but when I'm wearing my ICCAD hat, I'm still affiliated with ICCAD. I provide support to Bangladesh and several other LDCs in the UNFCCC negotiations. And so while you were speaking, I really started to think about how we need to engage with what's important for countries. And Terry has posted his recent TEDx talk in the chat. I'd really encourage people to look at that. I really like a quote that Teddy Roosevelt, a speech that Teddy Roosevelt made in 1910, after he left the presidency, he did a world tour. And he talks about the man in the arena. I'll put it in the chat. He talks about the man in the arena. It's not the critic who counts, but the man in the arena who's getting dirty and making mistakes. And that's the person who actually knows. I think vulnerable developing countries are in the arena. They're the ones whose needs we should be really reflecting on and addressing. I want to share very briefly, I hope I can take some of the time I saved in my intervention, to share one of the most profound experiences I had in the field in Bangladesh was in Patuakhali, which is in southern coastal Bangladesh. It's about 7 ferry rides away from Dhaka. I went there with a team from ActionAid, and we went, one of our first stops was to a village to listen to a women's savings group there. The poorest and most vulnerable women came together to save money to build the resilience of their households and also the community. And the gentleman from the local partner really struck me. He was sitting in the corner, he was quiet, but he was profoundly respectful. And that has forever affected me, because he listened to what was important for those women. There were power dynamics at play there, certainly. But he respected what they had to say, and in their intervention, ActionAid was doing their very, very best to address the reasons why those women were marginalized and vulnerable. So I think in this partnership, I really hope that that's how we take this work forward. And again, this is not with my ODI hat. I would really encourage us to really engage with what's important for Bangladesh. And that's adaptation and loss and damage. So I understand that we're calling this series Adaptation Resilience, and that's what the COP26 presidency is engaging with. But we also need to engage with on the ground reality. So I really hope that that's how we take things forward. Thank you so much, Simon.
Just loss and damage has come up a few times, Erin, and I know it's a highly controversial topic in the COP context. And the reason it's controversial is because rich countries think they're going to be sued for damage in poor countries, if I put it crudely. Is there a diplomatic solution to that, which is going to enable countries like the UK to provide more money to countries like Bangladesh? Salim, let me call on you, because I know you've worked a lot on loss and damage.
Sure. So you're quite right. It is politically sensitive, but it is something I think that can no longer be dodged anymore. It has been dodged for a long time by the richer countries. And given the framing of this entire series between the UK and Bangladesh, where the UK will be chairing the COP26 and Bangladesh will be representing the climate vulnerable countries, it is really a high level issue that at the political level, both countries should come to some kind of a solution to it, and not just leave it to their negotiators who just, come to a dead end and aren't able to negotiate. It is a political decision that needs to be taken at a very high political level. If that willingness is there, I do think that solution can be brought. And we don't have to use words like compensation and liability. We can use solidarity and support. The phrasing of it is not that important. The doing of it is the more important.
I'll tell you
Simon, if I could just add to that, if you don't mind. Very briefly, Lisa Van Halle at UCL has done some work on this, and she's found that when you really unpack what compensation means, what a lot of developed countries just mean is support to address the impacts of climate change. So we're not necessarily talking about taking countries to court. We're simply talking about, as Salim says, global solidarity. So I think that's something really to emphasize as well. Compensation doesn't have to be a bad word. We can unpack what it really means.
Very good. I want to move on from this topic, but I will just say that I think the idea that adaptation is a contributor to mitigation actually provides a really interesting opening for more discussion of and more funding for adaptation. Because if, as the Edinburgh case showed and the Barcelona case, you can demonstrate that what you're doing in terms of adaptation and resilience is also going to solve the basic problem of getting emissions down, then I think that developed countries will be very willing to provide additional finance. Now, we've had a couple of contributions, apart from Salim, from UK contributors. Are there any of our Bangladesh contributors who would like to raise other points which are not about loss and damage, but more generally about the lessons and our manifesto? Gholam Rabbani or Basil Karim or Professor Salehin or Diruba Haider, would you like to say anything, any of you?
I think. Can I come back,
yes,
Simon?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I was actually looking at the different questions in the chat box, and I want to clarify one of the questions immediately, because the question was whether CBF ends in next 4 years. Actually not. The 4 years is the initial period. So at the end of the 4 years period, there will be an evaluation. So based on the evaluation and the findings of the evaluation, we will continue for the next 10 years minimum. So CBF does not end actually 4 years. And I see Salimul Haq is one of the technical advisory committee member, and it is headed by Professor Ainur Nishar. So the second question that I see, whether how the projects are being selected under the CBF mechanism. So the projects are basically, one of the major criteria that we have is the whoever comes with or the concept note has to consult with the local communities, so that appropriate need comes from the local communities, and they have to consult with the local government authorities. So the policy, both policy and the needs are addressed. Thank you so much.
Just on this issue, just before I hand over to Andrew Jenkins for the last word, and then Salim and I will round up. Is it your view that NGOs are going to be there forever? I mean, or are you actually demonstrating a solution that somebody else should take up? Because often you hear NGOs say, well, we're demonstrating what can be done, and then somebody else, the government usually will take it up. But other times you hear that NGOs are going to be really side by side with people till the end of time. Where do you stand on that?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, what we are doing currently, at the beginning, we are supporting the NGOs to take the good practices or they scale up the different ideas on the ground. So, but we are also asking their exit strategy of the projects. I mean, what happens after the project, 3 years project or 5 years project. So at the end of the projects, they will hand these projects over to the relevant local authorities, so that they can scale up the good ideas and the good practices. So that's how we are currently implementing under the CBF mechanism.
Thank you. Really important point, though, that donors need to think that there needs to be a long-term engagement, and they can't just do pilot projects and move on. Andrew Jenkins, do you have access to a microphone? You can come in, and then we're going to stop. Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, that fits very well, because the point I wanted to make was to reinforce 2 points made earlier. The first one being this has to be a long-term process. I went to live and work in Noakhali for the first time on this issue in November 1979. So it's been a long story for us. And I think we have to bear that in mind, and we have to build on the achievements we already have and develop them and scale them up, as you mentioned earlier. And the second point is that it's very important that we have evidence and demonstrate success. We have been in this area of land resettlement and development. We've been collecting data according to IFAD standard measurements for most of that period of 40 years. And we have a long database showing very substantial and actually surprisingly high levels of increase in agricultural production. So people are not only feeding themselves, but they're feeding others from this new land. And also high rates of return, rapid increases in income, and most important, very big increases in assets versus net worth, assets versus liabilities. So that data collection and analysis, and not only from independent research, but also from practitioners and people who have this experience, is very important. And I think we have a lot to learn from it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Listen, let me say one final thing, then Salim, I'll give you the very last word and we'll end the meeting. That was all very helpful. Thank you. We will write these up, these notes. We have a very important meeting tomorrow, opened by the Bangladesh Foreign Minister and by Lord Ahmed from the FCDO, with the British High Commissioner also speaking, and Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who is the UK envoy now on resilience and adaptation, and then some other very good speakers, including both from Bangladesh and the UK. We want to make sure we carry over some of these findings into tomorrow's discussion, and particularly to turn the conversation from an in-depth exploration of case studies into something that can then become actionable by the kinds of people who are speaking to us tomorrow at the level of national policy and international funding. So from my side, thank you very, very much, all of you, for your fascinating contributions. And I'll now hand over back to Salim for the final word.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much to all our participants, and apologies for those who might have wanted to speak but weren't able to. Let me just say that today, to me, is the beginning of a conversation that I think has started very well and should certainly not end today. We'd like to take this forward, and let me offer another milestone point for us to take it forward, which happens in January, where we will be organizing, my center will be organizing the Gobeshona conference, which is a 4-day-long conference focusing on locally led adaptation in particular, but across the board on adaptation and resilience. I'd like to invite all the speakers and panelists who participated today to come back again. We will follow up this conversation, and it's not just, again, a single event, as Andrew just said. It is with a long-term view of collaborating over the next 10 years. So it's what I call a 10-year journey that we are embarking on together. And let this be a 10-year journey between the UK and Bangladesh at many different levels, amongst academics, amongst government officials, amongst engineers, amongst planners. Let us continue this conversation that we are beginning in this series of events, but then take them forward over the next 10 years to be able to reach the real adaptation and resilience that we want all countries to achieve within the next 10 years by 2030. So with that, let me end this meeting for today. Invite you all to join us again tomorrow. Also let you know that we will be doing a follow-up in LinkedIn. For those of you who are interested, please do join us on LinkedIn, where we can again continue these discussions online in the LinkedIn platform as well.